The morning HOA. Karen tried to block my service dog, didn't warm up or ease in. It arrived already hostile, already convinced it owned me. She came down my driveway like the law had personally deputized her, chin high, clipboard tight in her grip, eyes scanning my property as if she were cataloging violations that only existed in her head. Blackridge Court was silent behind her, the kind of suburban quiet that makes authority figures feel powerful because no one is interrupting them. My porch flag didn't move, the air didn't stir, and Max sat beside me exactly where he was trained to sit, alert without being reactive, present without being threatening. She didn't greet me because people like HOA Karen don't greet, they declare. She opened her mouth already certain of compliance, already expecting me to shrink back under the weight of rules she had rehearsed for moments like this. I could tell by her posture that she'd been waiting to use her voice, waiting to unleash it on someone who couldn't stop her. This wasn't confusion, it wasn't concern, and it definitely wasn't about a dog. It was about control, the kind that only feels real when it's exercised publicly. And she had chosen my driveway as her stage. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Her voice carried before her shadow did, sharp and practiced, announcing that my service dog was not allowed in her neighborhood. She called it a pet-free community with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged on what those words actually meant. The clipboard in her hands wasn't authority. It was a prop, but she held it like a badge that gave her permission to humiliate. She told me I was in violation before I had spoken a single word. She said my name like it was already written on a citation, like the outcome had been decided somewhere I wasn't invited. I didn't answer her immediately because silence has a way of making insecure people reveal themselves. Instead, I reached down and clipped Max's leash into the bright red vest that clearly identified him as a service dog. The movement was calm, deliberate, and unmistakable, and it irritated her more than any argument ever could. She saw that vest and chose to ignore it, because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging law she couldn't control. The stillness around us made her louder, not quieter, because unchecked authority always escalates when it senses resistance. She started citing HOA codes, rattling off section numbers like they were scripture, mispronouncing half of them, but saying them with conviction. She leaned forward as she spoke, invading space the way bullies do when they expect retreat. Her tone shifted from administrative to personal, from enforcement to accusation, and that was when I knew exactly what this was going to become. Max didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't growl, because his training wasn't built for drama. It was built for stability. He watched her the way he'd been taught to watch threats, calmly, attentively, without feeding them. That calm unnerved her because she needed chaos to justify her aggression. She accused me of disrupting the balance of the neighborhood, using the word balance like it was sacred, like discomfort on her part outweighed my rights. She said people had complained, though she didn't name who, because invented consensus is a favorite weapon of people who rule by fear. I finally looked at her directly and told her that her bylaws stopped where federal law began. The sentence wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't meant to impress anyone. It was meant to draw a line. She froze for a split second, the kind of pause that happens when someone realizes they might be standing on the wrong side of power. Then she recovered the only way she knew how, by getting louder and leaning harder into authority she didn't have. She told me she didn't care what I thought my dog did, that allergies mattered more than accommodations, that her community rules came first. She spoke faster now, stacking complaints on top of each other, hoping quantity would replace legitimacy. I stepped off the porch so we were standing on equal ground, not to confront her physically, but to remove the illusion that she was speaking down to me. I asked her if she actually knew what the Americans with Disabilities Act said, or if she just liked the sound of telling people no. When I cited the statute and explained that restricting a certified service dog on private property was federal interference, her face tightened. She laughed it off, claiming she'd heard fake legal threats before, insisting her 12 years as HOA president made her an expert. Experience without accountability does that to people. It convinces them that repetition equals correctness. I warned her that every word she said from that point forward could be used in a formal ADA complaint. The threat wasn't emotional, it was procedural, and that distinction mattered more than she understood. She opened her mouth to continue until Max stood up between us, not aggressively, not protectively, just assertively. That single movement shifted the dynamic, because trained authority doesn't announce itself. It positions itself. She took a step back before she realized she was doing it, then covered by calling him dangerous. I told her he was trained, more thoroughly than anyone enforcing imaginary rules that morning. By then, blinds were lifting along the street, neighbors watching quietly, recognizing a familiar pattern, but sensing this time was different. She wasn't policing mailboxes or paint colors anymore. She was challenging federal law in public. I told her she was harassing a disabled veteran, and that recording this interaction would be my next step if she didn't leave. She threatened to call the HOA board, animal control, even the sheriff, because escalation is the last refuge of false authority. I welcomed it, because escalation only benefits the person standing on solid legal ground. She stormed off, dialing her phone, muttering about disrespect, entitlement dripping from every step. Max sat back down beside me, without command, his job already done. I watched her disappear around the corner, knowing she believed this was the beginning of my problem. In reality, it was the beginning of hers. Calm has a way of being misunderstood, especially by people who rely on intimidation to feel powerful. HOA Karen saw my restraint and assumed it meant uncertainty, because in her world, silence only exists when someone is afraid to speak. What she couldn't see, and what she never bothered to ask, was that composure under pressure wasn't something I learned from homeowner meetings or neighborhood disputes. It was something carved into me long before I ever bought that house, or stood on that porch with Max at my side. For 12 years, I served in the United States Air Force, not in a role built around bravado or spectacle, but in logistics and operations, where failure doesn't announce itself until it's already too late. My job wasn't to shout orders or chase recognition. It was to keep systems functioning when stress, chaos, and human error threatened to tear them apart. That kind of work teaches you quickly that emotion clouds judgment, and that authority only holds when it's backed by structure and law. I learned early that when pressure rises, your voice shouldn't. Your thinking should sharpen, your movements should slow, and your words should carry weight instead of volume. Those habits didn't disappear when I retired. They stayed with me, settling into my bones, guiding how I respond when someone tries to corner me with manufactured power. Max entered my life through that same system of structure and accountability. He wasn't a comfort purchase or a sentimental decision. He was assigned through a Department of Defense medical program coordinated with the VA, after evaluations, paperwork, and verification that stripped the process of emotion and replaced it with necessity. He was trained to detect changes in my physiology before panic could take hold, to interrupt cycles I sometimes didn't even realize had started. He wasn't there to make me feel better. He was there to keep me functional. 5 years of working together builds a language that doesn't need commands. He knows when to sit, when to stand, when to position himself between me and stress without escalating it. That morning on the porch, when he rose calmly between HOA Karen and me, he wasn't reacting to her tone. He was reacting to escalation. That distinction matters, and it's one most people who fear dogs refuse to understand. When I retired from service, I didn't choose my property randomly. I wanted distance from unnecessary oversight, from committees that mistake preference for law. I made sure my deed placed me outside the HOA's jurisdiction, beyond the reach of dues, votes, and aesthetic enforcement. It was intentional, calculated, and documented. At the time, I believed that distance was enough. What I underestimated was how people like HOA Karen reinterpret boundaries when they're accustomed to compliance. To her, authority wasn't tied to maps or filings. It was a feeling, reinforced every time someone nodded instead of pushing back. Over time, that feeling grew until she convinced herself community spirit meant universal control. The first sign of that delusion came quietly. A note on my mailbox, folded neatly, stamped officially, written in language that pretended politeness while demanding obedience. It informed me that unapproved animals were prohibited in shared spaces and that compliance was expected. No greeting, no inquiry, just assumption. I remember reading it and feeling something close to amusement, not because it was harmless, but because it was so confidently wrong. Instead of confronting her immediately, I did what training taught me to do. I verified. I pulled the HOA charter from county records, read every clause, every amendment, every footnote she liked to reference without understanding. Then I cross-checked it against federal accessibility law, because hierarchy matters. Federal law doesn't argue with neighborhood policies. It supersedes them completely. That isn't opinion or interpretation. It's structure. By the time HOA Karen scheduled her so-called compliance check, I already knew how little ground she was standing on. When her committee showed up uninvited, clipboards in hand, measuring things they had no authority to measure, it confirmed what I'd suspected. She wasn't confused. She was expanding. Standing there with my property deed in hand, watching her mask slip for just a second when the word trespass entered the conversation, I realized this wasn't going to end with a warning or an apology. People who've never faced consequence don't stop on their own. So when I called the Department of Justice ADA helpline and was told plainly that no HOA could override accessibility protections, it wasn't validation I felt. It was confirmation. And confirmation is where preparation turns into action. Once you stop looking at an HOA like a neighborhood organization and start looking at it like a power structure, the patterns become impossible to ignore. HOA Karen didn't just preside over meetings or enforce bylaws. She curated an ecosystem where fear did most of the work for her. Authority, in her hands, wasn't about fairness or consistency. It was about predictability, making sure everyone knew what would happen if they stepped out of line. She built compliance the way some people build routines, through repetition, embarrassment, and the quiet understanding that resistance would be punished, not debated. Every homeowner on Black Ridge Court understood this without ever having it stated outright, because she made examples out of people just often enough to keep the rest obedient. Her inner circle was small, but effective, not because they were competent, but because they were loyal. There was the so-called legal advisor, a retired paralegal who liked to threaten litigation more than he liked facts, and who knew just enough terminology to scare people who didn't. There was the head of the Community Standards Committee, a woman who quoted regulations that didn't exist with absolute confidence, banking on the assumption that no one would check. Their meetings weren't about governance or discussion. They were about alignment, making sure everyone would repeat the same story if questioned. Disagreement wasn't argued against. It was quietly isolated. Karen's real strength came from selective enforcement. She didn't apply rules evenly. She applied them strategically. An elderly widow received citations for trash bins she physically couldn't move after her husband passed away. A retired firefighter was fined for replacing a porch light with a brighter bulb after his home was nearly broken into. Small things, humiliating things, always framed as community safety while ignoring the human cost. The message was clear. Compliance was cheaper than dignity. People learned quickly that pushing back wasn't worth the attention it brought. What made her dangerous wasn't just her willingness to abuse rules. It was her network. Her cousin worked in the county sheriff's department, close enough to enforcement to make calls feel serious. Her brother-in-law ran a small real estate agency that seemed to benefit every time a homeowner was fined into financial strain. She even had a friend who'd once worked in zoning, someone who could casually explain which violations would draw scrutiny and which would be ignored. None of it looked criminal on the surface, but together it formed a pressure system that kept people quiet. It wasn't an HOA anymore. It was a miniature regime built on favors and fear. I'd seen systems like that before, systems that hid behind procedure while punishing anyone who questioned them. On paper, they looked legitimate. In practice, they functioned on intimidation. Karen didn't need to shout often because the memory of her shouting did the work for her. When she smiled in meetings, people nodded. When she frowned, people apologized. That's how power entrenches itself, not through constant force, but through anticipation of it. The compliance check on my property wasn't an isolated incident. It was a test. She wanted to see if I would react the way others had, flustered, defensive, eager to smooth things over. When I didn't, when I met her with documentation instead of excuses, it disrupted the pattern she relied on. That was why she smirked when she talked about expanding oversight, why she dismissed property lines as imaginary. She believed authority was something you claimed, not something you proved. The moment I held up my deed and used the word criminal, I saw it hit her. Not emotionally, but structurally. That word doesn't belong in HOA conversations, and hearing it introduced a risk she hadn't calculated. Still, she fell back on her usual response, deflection and delay, promising to consult an attorney, confident that time and confusion would protect her. She assumed I'd grow tired or intimidated. She assumed wrong. Behind the scenes, her power structure was already fragile, held together by the belief that no one would ever document it thoroughly enough to expose the pattern. Every altered report, every selectively enforced citation, every whispered threat relied on silence to survive. What Karen didn't realize was that silence works both ways. Just as it had kept her in power, it was now allowing me to observe, record, and prepare without tipping my hand. By the time she realized this wasn't going to be another neighbor she could bully into submission, the structure she'd built for over a decade was already under strain. Her authority depended on people believing she was untouchable. Once that belief cracked, even slightly, everything she controlled became vulnerable. The moment intimidation failed, the situation stopped being emotional and became procedural, which is always the most dangerous shift for people who rely on fear. HOA Karen was still operating as if this were a neighborhood dispute, something she could outlast with pressure and noise. I wasn't. From the moment I understood she was willing to ignore federal law in public, I knew the only correct response was documentation, slow, thorough, and impossible to dispute. Federal cases are not built on outrage or moral arguments. They are built on timelines, records, and patterns that speak louder than any confrontation ever could. I started with the simplest rule I'd learned long before this situation ever existed. If it isn't documented, it didn't happen. Every note she sent, every email copied to the board, every message posted in the community forum was archived. Screenshots were saved with timestamps. Envelopes were photographed before they were opened. Phone calls were logged the moment they ended. It wasn't paranoia. It was discipline. People like HOA Karen rely on the assumption that most targets won't bother keeping records because it feels tedious and exhausting. I leaned into that tedium because patience is a weapon when you know how to use it. Rumors started circulating almost immediately. She told neighbors I was exploiting a loophole, that my dog wasn't legitimate, that I was trying to get special treatment. She didn't say these things directly to me anymore, because she'd learned that anything said to my face could be turned against her. Instead, she whispered, relying on the old system of social pressure she'd perfected. What she didn't realize was that those whispers were reaching people who were already tired of being afraid. Screenshots began to arrive in my inbox without me asking. Conversations she assumed were private started to surface, and each one added weight to the file I was building. When she filed a formal HOA complaint accusing me of community disruption and unregistered animals, she thought she was escalating. In reality, she was handing me a gift. Filing false complaints against a federally protected service animal isn't just harassment. It's a trigger. I forwarded her complaint, untouched, directly to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, along with a concise summary and the documentation trail that led up to it. I didn't editorialize. I didn't dramatize. I let her own words do the work. Within 72 hours, I received confirmation that a preliminary inquiry had been opened. It was quiet, understated, and devastating. From that point forward, everything she did mattered more than she understood. When I noticed her SUV idling down the street late one afternoon, pretending to check her phone while watching my house, I logged it. When her committee cars slowed as they passed my property, I logged it. Surveillance doesn't stop being surveillance just because it's amateur. The night I caught two figures photographing my yard and Max under cover of darkness, I didn't confront them. I recorded. The vehicle was registered to the HOA's Community Standards Committee. That footage went straight into the file, forwarded without commentary to the same federal inbox that was already paying attention. Silence followed, the kind that feels unnatural when you've been under constant pressure. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to breathe, but I didn't relax. Silence in situations like this doesn't mean resolution. It means recalibration. Sure enough, HOA Karen responded the only way she knew how, by calling an emergency meeting and framing herself as the victim. Her letter accused me of destabilizing the neighborhood and inviting outside interference, wrapping panic in the language of community protection. I didn't attend. I watched the live stream instead, listening carefully as her voice cracked and her authority slipped in front of an audience that was no longer fully on her side. The shift became visible when her own manager spoke up during that meeting. Not emotionally, but professionally. He informed her that federal agencies had contacted the HOA directly and requested financial disclosures, enforcement expense records, and property transfer documentation. The question he asked next was simple and devastating: whether any association funds had been used for personal matters. Her silence answered more clearly than any denial ever could. In that moment, the narrative she'd controlled for years fractured in real time. From there, the discovery phase accelerated. I filed a Freedom of Information request with the county zoning office for every complaint filed by the HOA over the past 5 years. When the records came back, the pattern was unmistakable. The majority of complaints had been filed personally by her, not by residents. Most targeted single homeowners repeatedly. Several involved service or support animals. Numbers don't argue, and these numbers told a story of selective enforcement and personal fixation. I built a timeline that stripped away coincidence. Complaint issued, inspection initiated, safety violation declared, property listed for sale, purchased by an affiliate connected to her family. The sequence repeated too cleanly to dismiss. What she'd been calling enforcement was starting to look like strategy. Every entry was logged, cross-referenced, and sourced. By the time I assembled the report, it didn't read like a neighborhood dispute anymore. It read like an after-action brief. When I uploaded the full file through the DOJ's secure portal and received confirmation that the materials had been logged under an active docket, I understood something important. This was no longer about proving her wrong. It was about letting the system she'd ignored finally see her clearly. And once that happens, there is no way to talk your way out of it. Power collapses fastest when it's forced into the open. And that was exactly where HOA Karen found herself once the federal inquiry stopped being a rumor and started becoming visible. She had survived for years by keeping conflicts private, by isolating targets one at a time, and letting embarrassment do the work for her. Public scrutiny was the one environment she couldn't control, and it showed the moment she realized her name was no longer being whispered, but documented. Every move she made after that was reactive, clumsy, driven by panic rather than calculation, and that shift was impossible to hide from people who had watched her dominate with confidence for so long. The first real fracture happened at what she called a town hall meeting, though it functioned more like a tribunal. She stood at the front of the room, with her familiar posture, clipboard in hand, attempting to reclaim authority through routine. She talked about harmony, standards, and community values, repeating the same phrases she'd used for years, expecting the room to respond the way it always had. But the energy was different. People weren't nodding automatically anymore. They were listening, weighing, watching for cracks. When she paused for applause, it didn't come. That was when I stood. Not dramatically, not angrily, just enough to shift attention. The silence that followed wasn't hostile, it was curious, and curiosity is dangerous for someone who relies on fear. I didn't accuse her or raise my voice. I spoke about law, about structure, about the difference between authority and assumption. When I mentioned federal oversight, her smile tightened. When I produced the acknowledgement letter confirming the inquiry, the room changed completely. Papers don't shout, but they carry a weight that no speech can match. She tried to dismiss it as a bluff, a misunderstanding, anything that would preserve her image. But her allies weren't as confident anymore. The head of the Standards Committee read the letter herself, her expression shifting as she saw the case number and official language. Whispers rippled through the room, not angry ones, but cautious ones. The kind people use when they realize they've been standing on unstable ground. Karen snapped at them to regain control, but the tone no longer worked. Authority that has to demand silence has already lost it. What followed wasn't an explosion. It was a slow deflation. People began speaking up, not all at once, but enough to change the dynamic. Someone mentioned a fine that never made sense. Someone else brought up a warning they'd received after disagreeing with her. Patterns started forming in real time, connecting dots that had always been visible but never discussed openly. Karen responded the only way she knew how, by trying to shut it down, declaring the meeting adjourned, banning me from attending future sessions. The declaration landed hollow, stripped of its usual force. Outside that room, momentum took over. Emails started circulating, attachments appearing, old inspection reports being re-examined. A retired firefighter sent me documentation showing how photos of his porch had been altered to exaggerate a violation. An elderly widow forwarded correspondence that revealed how quickly compassion had turned into penalties when she couldn't comply. Each piece added context, and context is lethal to false narratives. Karen had always relied on isolation, and now everything was being compared side by side. Media attention followed naturally, not because anyone called for it, but because stories like this attract it once they break containment. A local reporter began asking questions. Simple ones, the kind that don't sound threatening until they're answered on record. Karen attempted to spin, framing herself as a defender of community standards under attack by outside forces. But when she dismissed disability protections on camera, the damage was immediate. Words spoken in private can be denied. Words spoken publicly become evidence. The presence of federal representatives removed any remaining ambiguity. When a DOJ agent arrived on site, calm and procedural, it shattered the illusion that this was still an HOA matter. Karen tried to insert herself into the interaction, speaking over him, demanding attention, asserting relevance. He addressed me instead, confirming compliance, acknowledging documentation, and making it clear why he was there. When he handed her the formal warning, the paper seemed heavier than anything she'd ever held. Her disbelief wasn't dramatic. It was stunned, the look of someone realizing too late that volume doesn't override jurisdiction. Neighbors gathered without being invited, drawn by the gravity of the moment. This wasn't gossip. It was accountability unfolding in daylight. When the agent informed her she was suspended pending investigation, effective immediately, the words didn't echo. They settled. No shouting followed, no grand protest. Just a woman standing very still as the role she'd built her identity around evaporated in a sentence. That kind of loss doesn't scream, it hollows. She didn't accept it quietly, of course. Panic drove her to send mass emails accusing me of manipulation, of staging evidence, of conspiring with outsiders to destabilize the community. Those messages didn't rally support the way she expected. They exposed desperation. One of them was forwarded directly to federal investigators within minutes, turning another attempt at control into another violation. Each action she took to save herself tightened the frame around her. The formal collapse came quickly after that. Subpoenas arrived. Bank accounts were frozen pending audit. Board members resigned, citing ignorance, though their signatures told a different story. The structure she'd built unraveled not because it was attacked aggressively, but because it was examined carefully. In hearings that followed, evidence spoke without emotion. Financial records showed misuse. Enforcement logs showed targeting. Emails showed intent. Karen sat through it all, shrinking with each confirmed fact. When the board was dissolved and she was barred from holding any leadership position, there was no celebration. The decision was delivered plainly, like a conclusion that had always been waiting to be reached. Her protest sounded small in the room it once would have dominated. As she was escorted out, there were no jeers, no applause, just quiet acknowledgement that something long overdue had finally ended. I didn't feel triumphant watching her power collapse. I felt relieved. Relief that the system she'd abused had finally noticed. Relief that the people she'd intimidated could breathe without waiting for consequences. And as I stood there with Max at my side, steady as he'd been from the beginning, I understood that public collapse isn't about humiliation. It's about visibility. Once everything is seen clearly, there's nowhere left for false authority to hide. Losing visible power doesn't make people like HOA Karen reflective. It makes them reckless. Once the board suspended her and federal scrutiny became unavoidable, she stopped pretending this was about policy and started treating it like a personal war. That shift mattered, because desperation strips away discipline, and undisciplined actions leave clean trails. What followed wasn't strategy, it was flailing, each move exposing how deeply she'd misunderstood the systems she'd tried to dominate for years. Her first instinct was retaliation through narrative. She sent out mass emails to the entire community, framing herself as the victim of a coordinated attack. She accused me of manipulating federal agencies, of staging evidence, of weaponizing disability protections to escape accountability. The language was frantic, uneven, full of absolutes and accusations without support. In her mind, volume could still replace legitimacy. In reality, every message became another artifact, another time-stamped exhibit folded neatly into an expanding federal file. Expert retaliation doesn't look like shouting matches or angry replies. It looks like silence paired with process. I didn't respond to her messages, didn't defend myself publicly, didn't argue online. I let professionals do what they're trained to do. Federal auditors moved in quietly, requesting records without fanfare. Financial disclosures were pulled. Enforcement expenses were examined line by line. Property transfer histories were cross-referenced against violation timelines. Karen had spent years hiding behind complexity, assuming no one would ever take the time to untangle it. That assumption collapsed quickly under expert scrutiny. As the audits progressed, her allies began to fracture. People who had once echoed her confidence started seeking distance, offering cooperation in exchange for leniency. The retired paralegal, who'd signed threatening letters, surrendered correspondence showing how citations had been fabricated or exaggerated. The Standards Committee head turned over meeting minutes, revealing votes that had been altered after the fact. Even her family connections began to unravel, transactions surfacing that tied enforcement actions directly to financial benefit. Each revelation didn't just implicate her, it isolated her further. Karen responded the only way she knew how, by escalating again. She attempted to call emergency meetings she no longer had authority to convene. She distributed flyers accusing me of endangering the neighborhood, using the HOA logo she was barred from using. She showed up unannounced at properties she once controlled, only to be turned away by homeowners who no longer feared her. Every attempt to reassert control ended the same way. Documented, reported, and added to the record as evidence of continued interference. Meanwhile, the experts worked without emotion. Investigators didn't argue with her claims, they verified facts. Lawyers didn't debate her intentions, they traced outcomes. When the Department of Justice confirmed formal proceedings, it wasn't delivered as a dramatic announcement. It arrived as a letter, precise and impersonal, outlining allegations, statutes, and next steps. That kind of communication doesn't invite rebuttal. It proceeds whether you accept it or not. The retaliation phase exposed the core truth of Karen's power trip. She'd never actually understood authority. She'd mimicked it, borrowed its language, and relied on intimidation to maintain it. Faced with professionals who operated on evidence rather than fear, she had nothing left to leverage. Her voice, once enough to quiet rooms, now carried no weight at all. For me, this phase required restraint more than action. The instinct to respond, to correct the record publicly, had to be suppressed. Expertise thrives on patience. I continued to document, to comply, to wait. Max remained beside me through it all, steady as ever, a constant reminder that discipline isn't passive, it's controlled. Watching her attempts at retaliation dissolve into self-incrimination wasn't satisfying in a loud way. It was satisfying in a procedural one. By the time formal charges were prepared and restitution numbers calculated, Karen was no longer a figure of authority or even opposition. She was a case study. Her retaliation hadn't saved her. It had clarified her intent. And in systems built on law rather than ego, clarity is the last thing someone like her ever wants to provide. The end didn't arrive with applause or speeches. It arrived the way accountability usually does, quietly and without negotiation. Court filings were finalized, restitution amounts calculated, leadership bans formalized in language that didn't care how loud someone used to be. There was no room for interpretation, no emotional framing, no space for Karen to argue herself back into relevance. The system she'd tried to bend simply moved forward without her, and that was the most humiliating part of all. When authority stops acknowledging you, there's nothing left to fight. The judgment dissolved the HOA board entirely, voided past enforcement actions, and stripped her of any ability to hold community leadership again. Financial penalties were issued in numbers she couldn't talk her way out of. Restitution allocated to the people she'd pressured for years. Her name appeared on every page where responsibility was assigned, repeated often enough to make denial impossible. It wasn't dramatic, it was administrative, and administrative endings are permanent. After the ruling, the neighborhood changed without ceremony. There were no banners, no announcements, no victory meetings. Notes stopped appearing on doors. Threatening letters vanished. The driveways she used to patrol stayed empty. People began speaking to each other again without lowering their voices. The absence of her presence did more to restore peace than any public apology ever could. I saw her one last time by accident in a county office hallway. No clipboard, no entourage, no practiced confidence. She looked smaller, not physically but structurally, like someone whose identity had been removed piece by piece until nothing familiar remained. She didn't shout or accuse. She just said I'd ruined her life. I told her the truth, that she'd done that herself the moment she decided someone else's rights were optional. She didn't respond. She turned away and walked off, footsteps fading faster than I expected. Back on Black Ridge Court, the quiet settled in naturally. Kids rode bikes where tension used to hang. Flags flew without being measured. The rules that remained were the ones that mattered, the kind that don't need enforcement because they're grounded in law instead of preference. I walked with Max without scanning for confrontation, without preparing responses, without bracing for escalation. He stayed close, not because he needed to, but because that was who he was. There was no lesson I felt compelled to teach and no moral I needed to announce. The outcome spoke clearly enough on its own. Karen didn't lose because I was louder or angrier or more persuasive. She lost because power built on intimidation collapses the moment it's examined. The law doesn't need to raise its voice. It just waits. In the end, there was no confrontation left to win, no authority left for her to claim, no audience left to intimidate. The neighborhood moved on, the system closed its file, and the noise she'd relied on for years drained out of everything she touched. What remained was stillness, earned and unremarkable, the kind that doesn't announce victory because it doesn't have to. HOA Karen went silent.